groups that are really truly moving the wealth around and transacting commercial business globally, they are gunning for major societal changes. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this third week of January, this Crashes and Taxes podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Walser, super excited to be with you this week. And there's a lot of economic news and data to go through, and I'm going to walk you guys through what I think is important. But I want to start off today giving you a metric that I think is super telling and that will really allow you into my mind and my world of, hey, do you understand what is happening and why you cannot believe what the news media or what Wall Street is sort of saying right now? And it's really hard for me to come up with these perspectives because I love the market and I am Milton Friedman, free Adam Smith, the invisible hand believer. And therefore, it's hard for someone like me who's so data driven by numbers and facts to believe that this information that is being pushed out there is in fact being data manipulated. But unfortunately, this is where we are in 2024. And from a global perspective, I have to say that I'm seeing a consensus form amongst peers that this is the year. This is the year. And the reason that this is the year, if you need to understand, is because when you look at the society that the people that really run the world are trying to bring forward, it is being game theoried out. And the game theory shows that the transitions that the people that are really truly running the world want to make, the transitions that these people want to make, these transitions potentially are so revelational that they could take up to 20 years to actually implement. And that's not going to happen. I can tell you right now, there is no way that what they want to happen is going to wait 20 years. And so because they cannot have their game theory actually be reality, they cannot allow what they want to come to fruition to take 20 years, they are going to intervene and they are going to make these things happen much, much faster. I wish I could say like exactly what I'm trying to say to you and come out and say it, but it can't be said, unfortunately, that directly because the channels that disseminate, this podcast and this information, they wouldn't have that housed or platformed on their channel. So we have to be a lot more kind of vague, which is also good for me because I like to be right always about what I'm saying, and whether or not I know what I'm saying is right. What I don't know is their time frame, because we can know what's coming, but we don't know necessarily the time frames. So what I want to explain to you is that the groups that are really truly moving the wealth around and transacting commercial business globally, they are gunning for major societal changes. And I would point you to the WEF document and really what's been kind of coming out since the pandemic of 2020, which is this concept of you will own nothing and you will be happy. And that's going to be kind of the theme that I'm going with. You will own nothing and you will be happy. That's going to be the theme that I'm trying to support now to show you economically why you're being sold a certain bill of goods. And yet really the truth is not what we're being sold. So I know that I say all that it's very cryptic and I apologize for those of you that are understanding what I'm saying, you're going to be tracking along with me. You're going to be getting it. And for the rest of you, I think that this podcast will probably get revisited as the year continues along, because we are going to be saying some very important things today. So let me just digress for a second and start by stating that who I am, because I want to thank all of you that are telling your friends, your family, your colleagues, your coworkers, hey, check out Crashes and Taxes. This is a tremendous platform that we get a lot of people getting this information on. And, this is a fun platform for me. This is something I enjoy doing, although it is a lot of work and it's a lot of research. I'm already doing the research anyways. So just gathering myself to take an hour a week to sit down and just give you this information one-on-one is really what I enjoy and I look forward to. If my team can allow me the time to do it, it's always great. And that's what I really enjoy. But for those of you that don't know who I am, because you've been referred over to this podcast through a friend, a family member, a colleague. I'm Rebecca Walser. I have 4 different college degrees. My specialty is finance and markets, economics. My undergrad is in business finance. I worked in the corporate world my entire career until I became a lawyer. So my undergrad is in finance. I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers for global financial services right out of college. And then I went to IBM AT&T, the networking piece that IBM sold to AT&T. And then I worked in real estate finance. And then I went to law school, became a lawyer. And then I knew that since I'm a business person, I'm a finance person, that tax law would really be the area of law that the specialty of law that would help my practice the most. I became a tax lawyer, practiced in a boutique tax environment for a few years before I understood that really I would need to open my own practice, because of the fact that I was not just solely a tax lawyer, but I'm a lot more holistically, economically and financially versed, and that I was really looking to bring holistic, total, complete solutions to the market. And so I did open my own wealth management firm 9 years ago now, and we're going into our 10th year. And we're very excited. We have grown tremendously. I would say we were not a medium-sized firm, but we're beyond the boutique with the size that we've grown to. And I'm very grateful and very blessed for that. So that's my background. And just not that it matters, but I do have also an additional degree, global MBA from the London School of Economics, which was a joint program with the London School of Economics, Enchanté, and based in Paris, which is the #1 global business school in the world. And of course, also in NYU, which I went to for law as well, NYU Law. So I want to share a very alarming data point with you before we actually get into the slides of today, because I think that this one data point will give you an understanding of the information that I am trying to convey to you in the best way I possibly can. And that is the fact that when we had the December jobs numbers, as you guys know, on Crashes and Taxes, I go back through the economic government data that comes out. And specifically, I'm talking now about the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they produce the monthly jobs numbers that we all and economists rely upon to see really the headwinds and how the economy is doing, how the labor market is doing, which is really one of the 2 core tenets of the Federal Reserve's policy-making responsibilities. They are to keep as close to full employment as they can, and there's to keep really a benchmark of inflation of around 2% a year. So these are the 2 mandates of the Federal Reserve, and this is why we track so closely the labor market and why we care so much about the labor market, because really it's the strength of the labor market in 2023 and 2022 or 2021 as well that really allowed Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell to raise rates as fast as he did between June 2022 and July 2023. Our last interest rate hike was July 26 of 2023. And we have had a pause since then, no cuts as yet. And of course, all of the market heard the Federal Reserve pause as they paused at the last FOMC meeting, and remember, we are having another FOMC meeting in January 30, January 31, which of course will be next week. But the last FOMC meeting, December meeting, that is where the Fed came out, Powell came out, and he basically said, we're keeping rates where they are, we're pausing. However, we do expect, and this is where we got further in guidance, we do expect that rates will be cut 3 times in 2024. Now, the market has been pushing the Fed and trying to push the Fed. And I feel actually bad for Powell. I'm not jealous of his position at all. I feel sorry for him because he is getting constantly backed into the corner, both from presidents that have said he's not doing enough or he's doing too much, both Trump and Biden, as well as the market itself, because the market is trying to achieve its goals with or without Powell, and they are wanting to push the narrative. And Wall Street is extremely adept at pushing their narrative. Let's be very clear. So what I found was very interesting was that when we looked at the December jobs numbers and we saw that the headline number of 216,000 jobs added completely beat expectations, which was 167,000 literally the day before the report came out. It got adjusted upward the day before the report to 170. And then, of course, the number came in with a smashing 216. However, when you drill down beyond the headline number, you saw that 50,000 of those jobs were federal government jobs. And so when you really extract the federal government jobs, you really get a miss on the jobs numbers. Now, this is concerning because we've had additionally in the December report, not only did we get the December number that was a total beat, but we also had 2 monthly revisions, both October and November. The October revision, which the October jobs numbers was, I'm just giving you rough numbers now, approximately 150,000, and they reduced 45,000 jobs in the December revision for October. And so when we went back and we kind of looked at what has the BLS done these last, 12 months, what we found is of the last 11 months, 10 have been substantially, statistically significantly, I'm sorry, that's my mathematician speak, substantially, and that means statistically significant. It's a statistically significant event, downward adjustment. And specifically, it's almost a 33% adjustment for just October alone. And so what we found is that the average adjustment to the downside after the fact, now I need you to understand, the market and Wall Street, it's like if you ever had a newspaper, which, they still exist, but they're mostly in digital format now. But if you ever had a newspaper that had like a front page headline, so-and-so is guilty of murder and, life sentence. And then a year later, the DNA evidence comes back that it was faulty and someone tainted it and planted the evidence. You don't get a front page headline that says, DNA evidence tampered with, murderer set free, or not a murderer, not guilty, set free. He's got to be paid, $10 million because he was wrongfully convicted and in jail for a year. You don't get that on the front page. No. They put that on like the last section of the back, which says editor's note, this information was incorrect. We are correcting it. Here it is. Nobody sees it. Nobody reads it. It obviously does the best job for the paper to minimize the fact that something that they previously reported was inaccurate. Not their fault. They didn't know. But what I'm trying to state is the headline runs the news and the correction is an afterthought. And it's the same way with the labor market. We get a huge, everyone is waiting. In fact, for December, I was on the panel in New York City on Fox Business waiting for the number to come out so we could really have an assessment of where the year was going to start at the beginning of January for the December number. And the truth is that the correction for October is a side note. So we went back and we looked at how many of these reports have been this way. We found out that 10 of the last 11 monthly reports have been adjusted, and they've been adjusted by an average of almost 50,000 jobs a month. Now, that you might think is doesn't sound like a lot. That is a lot when you're talking about a total jobs number of 150 to 200,000. That is a huge, statistically significant adjustment. So then what I said was, this is really interesting because I am not used to these BLS numbers continuously being inaccurate, overstated to the upside. When has this happened before? And this is the big tell. When we go back and we look at the downward revision history of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for jobs numbers, the last time that they were downwardly adjusted consistently for months and months and months was in 2008. Now, to give a little bit of just differentiation between now and 2008, in 2008, the average adjustment was 67,000 jobs being overstated, so that the downward adjustment would come in on average at 67,000. That is a bigger adjustment than the average of 48 that we're getting right now in 2023. However, it makes me super upset because the last major global financial economic correction was, of course, what the world calls the GFC, the global financial crisis. In America, we call it the Great Recession. And that is the 2008-2009 recession. Now, that is a huge economic event in the history of America, because that is when America went from more traditional monetary theory to what we now follow, and we have been following since 2008, which is MMT, modern monetary theory. It's this Keynesian economic theory that basically says it does not matter how much money a central bank or a federal government prints, as long as there is enough income to service that debt. And that economic theory is so wrong. And unfortunately, we as citizens of the earth in 2024, we are going to be the ones that realize through the pain that we are going to go through that MMT is a myth and that it is not a viable economic theory in any way, of any kind. In other words, you cannot disprove modern monetary theory unless you actually introduce it, leverage it, use it, and then have the financial collapse come. It is the only way to disprove modern monetary theory is to follow it and then see where it takes you. And unfortunately, that is what we in the United States of America have done. The United States of America is very unique in its position as the only sole global reserve currency and Forex. And so from that perspective, we are the ones that are going to suffer because we are the ones that are deflating the global reserve currency, i.e. the US dollar. And through that, along with some other things that the United States of America has done, such as kicking Russia out of the SWIFT international payment processing system, that is the system of what we call the West, they have aligned and inserted themselves with some of our staunchest economic adversaries. And even though they seem like economic alliances, specifically China is our largest trading partner. We are the biggest importer of Chinese goods, bar none, on the face of the earth. And if China doesn't have us buying their goods, there's a huge problem. If we don't have China selling us their goods, there's a huge problem. But make no mistake, the Chinese motto for the future of their country is not, they are out to dominate economically and militarily the entire world, including the United States. You know, I am not an advocate of communism in any way, and I think people should be free, but I have serious concerns about the viability of American exceptionalism, because we have in China, just to give you kind of an idea, we have the Chinese banning the use of video games during the week, during the school week, when children are supposed to be in school. They're not allowed. I mean, can you imagine the federal government saying no video games for children during the week? But this is what the Chinese government, as a communist government, can do. And so they've banned the video games during the week. So all of that time is being redirected to, I would assume, productive activities. But the other thing that they've done, and this is really interesting because you can go back and you can look at a 60 Minutes on this. I think Scott Pelley did a 60 Minutes on this. I want to say this is a while ago now. I want to say 2018, 2019. But, they have the technology where they put these headbands on the students in China, and they can, it flashes red or it turns red if your attention is no longer on what the teacher is saying and if your mind is off daydreaming. So now we literally have governments of the world reading the thoughts of children and redirecting their attention if their headband turns red and it's no longer green, because now the teacher knows that student has left the conversation, at least mentally. So now we're literally talking about the reading of our brain waves to ascertain whether or not someone is even paying attention. And so I tell you all this to say, if China's singular focus is to become the number one military and economic country in the world, bar none, and obviously they're coming after the current U.S. position that we've enjoyed, really, I would say, certainly since 74, since the birth of the petrodollar, but going beyond that, before that, I would say 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the world agreed that the US dollar would be the global reserve currency. When you have a country that is in writing, has, initiatives, 100-year plan, not that it's going to take 100 years, but they map out what their next 100 years looks like for their country in writing. This is a country that is just solely focused on a singular unified goal. And it's really hard for a capitalistic nation that, enjoys a lot of personal liberty and freedom to ever have that same singular focus, because we are a very diversified, unique group of citizens in this country, gladly so. And we aren't interested in saying, hey, let's take down the number one economic and military superpower, because right now that's us. I get so irritated and so offended by these people that start to hear someone question the viability of the sustainability of the US dollar as the sole reserve currency. And they sort of freak out and they just wave you off and say, oh my gosh, that will never happen. The dollar's not going anywhere. And I would agree that the dollar is not going anywhere, except for the field is going to get crowded. In other words, if you don't maintain a clear circumference around your nation, between you and the second highest economic nation, you're going to get competition. And absolutely and without a doubt, China is absolute competition for the United States of America. And because their citizenry is so focused on what the federal government or the communistic CCP is trying to do, they are going to, and they have made such massive headways economically and militarily, while the United States has likewise declined. All of this coming now in 2024 is problematic, because America is probably, I'm going to say, in my opinion, that America is likely at one of its weakest points in its history. And when I say weakest, I'm talking from a perspective of certainly infrastructure. The infrastructure of our country is truly falling apart. And yet there is no allocation of resources like we had with Lyndon Johnson, like we had with FDR. There's no massive road or works or projects getting people back to work through public works. None of that is happening. We're much more focused on border crisis issues, the 10 million people that have come here just since the beginning of this last administration. Why aren't the border laws being enforced? What is happening at the border? We're so literally distracted with all of these issues that are self-inflicted. We do have a border in this country. It's just not being enforced. And therefore 10 million people have come in. We have case backlogs now of the judges that handle immigration cases. We're talking about over 3,500 cases per judge. This is going to take them years to get through. And that's just the people that have come through in the last 3.5 years. And this is not a political discussion. I don't care what side of the fence you're on. I don't care. This is all economics. This all comes down to economics. A lot of people say, Rebecca, sometimes your talks are more political than they are economic. It's not that. It's that the politics affects the economics. The person who's in charge in the White House gets to implement a lot of policy decisions that get promulgated across all of the federal agencies, and then they're all working from the same playbook, and that affects the economics because it affects the border. It affects what's happening now in Texas, shipping immigrants to New York, where now New York is suing bus companies in Texas. This is called the Commerce Clause. It's not going to go anywhere, but all of politics affects economics, and certainly the Federal Reserve affects economics. And so this is why we discuss these things. They are that important. They are that integral to what is happening. So what I am trying to explain to you is that we are getting intentional data manipulation by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when you look at the last time this happened, and you see that it happened in 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis, and how massive that was, and the fact that we literally switched our monetary policy because of it, you understand that there is a truth that is not going to be able to be obfuscated or disguised for very much longer. And that truth is alarming because it's something that they're trying to intentionally prevent the public from understanding. And that is what my job is. I am trying through this podcast to assimilate all of the data that I leverage and rely on to run my wealth management practice on a weekly basis. I try to assimilate that into a short little half an hour snippet for you so that you could understand that the propaganda that is coming out of Wall Street, unfortunately, is just that. And so let's go ahead and walk through some of these slides very quickly for today, because I don't really have too much more information. I really wanted to hone on this data point and let you know that we are in a very similar situated position as we were in 2008 with this kind of government interference with the real economic numbers. I want to remind you, I did a podcast, Crashes and Tags, at the end of 2023, talking about what is next for the U.S. economy, 2024 predictions. And the biggest thing I want to clue in on is this CEO, C-suite, basically saying 84% of the C-suite stated that they believed recession was coming in 2024. And I'm starting to get more and more people that are in the know finally saying, yes. I've heard two different big, huge analytical groups this week even say, third week of January, yes, recession this year. So that's starting to mirror the C-suite. The important thing that I want you to understand is that the Federal Reserve is somewhat, and I did obviously cover this before, but the Federal Reserve is somewhat handicapped and sort of has their hands tied behind their back, because if you look at where our debt to GDP is in modern day, since literally coronavirus, we are above 100% debt to GDP. Now, the highest point prior to 2020 and modern times was right here at 103. And this was really at the height of World War II. You can see that's what it's talking about, World War II in this gray. You can see that we hit 103.9 percent debt to GDP. That's completely normal. In wartime, everybody basically prints paper, writes loans for military equipment, and your debt to GDP temporarily goes up. You can see that. It was a huge spike up. It was a very clear spike up. And then it came down over the years and stayed low, until we got to 2020 coronavirus, at which point we were at once again at pretty much 100% GDP, debt to GDP. But here are, from the Federal Reserve itself, are two data points that we want to talk about. You can see that our highest point ever was Q2 of 2020, smack dab, coronavirus, totally makes sense. We absolutely stimulated, because remember, we're on monetary theory, we can print as much as we want and it doesn't matter. So we totally stimulated, and we were at 132% debt to our gross domestic product, and that was our highest point ever. Where we are now, and this is our last measurement that we have, you can see was updated December 4th. We don't have an updated number as of yet, but you can see that as of Q3 of last year, we were at right under 120% debt to GDP. So I tell you all of that to explain to you that if before coronavirus, we weren't even at 100, and now post coronavirus, we're at 120. If something else comes forward in 2024, if something happens in 2024 that necessitates the Federal Reserve to once again fix it in a massive hurry because it says it's an economic disaster, we don't have the room for the Fed to do it, because the balance sheet of the Fed was sub $1 trillion, under $1 trillion, practically forever, until the dot-com crisis, when we went up to about 2 trillion, stayed at 2 trillion literally for the longest until it doubled to 4 trillion. And that came in 2008. And then, of course, with coronavirus, we stayed at, once we hit MMT, we absolutely doubled the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And after 2008, we stayed at 4 trillion, no problem, stayed until 2020 came, and then we doubled to 8 trillion. And guess what? We've been there ever since. All of the QT, the quantitative tightening that Jerome Powell did in 2022, 2023 has ultimately been erased by the fact that the Federal Reserve has once again added funds to the economy, as well as that they have implemented a new FOMC open facility, which is the Bank Term Funding Program, in which case they are lending money directly for treasuries to the banks. So really quickly, you can see here, this is from this past week, where we have Bank of America CEO Monahan basically warning that the full effect of the Federal Reserve's rate hikes have not yet even been seen. In fact, most analysts think that we've only seen about 75% of the impact of these higher rates. And that's because, you still have a lot of companies that have this extremely low cost of capital, because that lower financed debt is rolling off and it has to be refinanced. We have about $2 trillion that are going to be refinanced by corporations in 2024 and 2025. And of course, even if the federal funds rate, if the rates come down from where they are right now at 5.2555, if they come down to even 200 basis points less, so 3.2535, that's still over a 6x of what they previously were for the last 15 years, which is 25 basis points. So you're talking about all of these corporations have to refinance this debt at a cost that's 6 times what they've been used to paying for the last 15 years. And this is why, besides the fact that the CEOs know that the consumer is out of gas and has completely leveraged up all of the assets they could to continue to live their staying lifestyle before they finally accept that they have to start cutting. That's what this Bank of America is saying, is that this is not really what we think it is. Then you've got Jamie Dimon, and he was at Davos, WF last week. He did an interview with CNBC and Fox Business. And on both times, he said, listen, and Dimon is a little bit more, I think, telling it truthfully. He has a really great way. I wish I could emulate this about him, but he's a really great way of sort of saying what I'm saying, but a lot more less panicky and a lot less black and white. It almost sounds like butter, and like you sounds like it sounds fine, but then when you process what he's actually saying, you actually realize he's actually saying that no, we're actually not going to have a soft landing. And that we shouldn't just assume, and Wall Street that is correct at saying, yeah, there's a soft landing coming, everything's fine. He's saying no, that he's not seeing that necessarily, and that we should really be careful of just expecting that the economy and everything's going to go fine from here. Now, this is a very important chart. I could just probably do the podcast on this chart alone. And I want to show you, this is updated, not as often as what I would like, but this was last updated in November. And you can see that these gray shaded areas are actual recessions. These are what we would classify as recessions. And this is the net percentage of domestic banks that are tightening their lending standard for both commercial and industrial loans. So you have heard it said that we are a consumption-based economy. 70% of our economic viability is directly tied to the retail consumer, and that affects commercial industrial loans, because commercial and industrial loans are all creating products to be consumed by the end consumer, the retail consumer. So as retail consumption dries, because the consumer has nothing left to continue consuming, what happens is we enter into recessionary times. As we enter into recessionary times, or we have bad economic times, banks start to tighten their lending standards. Oh, we can't have such easy credit flow because times are economically going to be tighter. So we now have to be more restrictive of who we're actually making these commercial loans to. What I want you to see is that the blue line is the banks tightening lending standards. Into every single recession that we've had since modern age, the recession is always preceded by, or what comes first is the banks tightening credit. The banks can see through their metrics what's happening with the economy before the recession begins, and they tighten appropriately because they say the economy is going to go down. We need to have higher credit borrowers because we're going to get defaults. And so we're going to eliminate the lower credit borrowers that would get by in a fine economy. They will not get by in a tight economy. So if we go back here to the dot-com crash, you can see that beginning in 2000, banks staunchly tightened lending. And you can see here the dot-com crash happened. And there's the gray area. There's the actual recession coming after the bank lending standards tightened. And you can see it again here at the global financial crisis. You can see in 2007, this point here, lending standards were actually quite lax, even dipped below the zero line, and then straight up into 2008 and right through. And this was the whole too big to fail and, the troubled asset relief program. And we bought all those things out. You can see that this recession lasted substantially a long amount of time. And literally bank standards were tightened to the highest level in the modern day. Now, let's look over here. You can see going into 2020, the recession was as short as a couple of months because of all the stimulus that was created globally by world governments. We're talking about the equivalent of $20 trillion, and obviously domestic currencies and the US currencies printed globally through coronavirus. So that's why the recession in and of itself was so short-lived, such a little dash. But look what happened as a result of coronavirus. You had, once again, they didn't tighten to as tight as they got in 2008, but they almost reached the tightening or the restrictive lending standards of 2008 at the beginning of coronavirus. You can see it was very fast and very short-lived because immediately into 2021, those lending standards not only dropped back down, but they dropped down substantially. This would be a result of all of the stimulus funds that was put into effect. There was a surplus of funds. And so now we've got a lot of money. We can just lend it out and we can do whatever. But now I want you to see, okay, at the end of 2021, heading into 2022, and certainly into 2023, what happened again? We almost got back to the restrictive lending of 2020 again in 2021. And you can see that that has come down slightly at the tail end of 2023, but still it is substantially higher than the mean has been since 2008. So if we look at the fact that we switched to monetary theory, we switched to a much more accommodative Federal Reserve policy towards the individual consumer to continue to support a stimulus economy, you can see that the lending standards have mostly been below the zero line, in fact, lax standards, and yet now we're still substantially above. What this means and why you care is this means that banks have tightened their lending standards, which means there will be less loans, which means there is less capital getting into the system through the commercial banking process. And that in and of itself is recessionary forecasting. In other words, a recession comes anytime banks tighten to this level. There is a loss of capitalization available, and therefore the economy gets tighter, people lose jobs, layoffs are happening, and recession comes. Now, just to parlay on that, I don't have a slide for it, but I will just say last week, Citigroup announced 20,000 job cuts globally. So we are seeing, we obviously had some Amazon, some Google announcements, very small numbers, but that's because the tech industry shed 250,000 jobs. We're talking about 250,000 jobs in technology on the cusp of AI frontier that were shed in just 2023 alone. Now you can see here, this is the IMF basically stating that yes, there is a huge problem that the countries of the world pushed out a ton of liquidity through and for coronavirus and issued a lot of debt for that liquidity. There is a piper price to pay. We will pay the piper. The piper comes to get his money. And what she is saying is, now that short-term borrowing that was done in 2020 for the pandemic is coming due. And it's coming due after the central banks of the world have all raised their interest rates because inflation was so hot. They had to raise rates to slow everything down. Now it's like really stupidity at its finest if you think about it, because all these world central bankers print all this money. They print it on a very short-term basis. Then they say, oh my gosh, it's too much money that we flooded into the system at once to fight coronavirus. Now we've got to raise interest rates. They have just raised the rates at which they will be repapering or refinancing this debt. And guess what? The countries of the world cannot afford it. They cannot afford it. So that is also a massive concern for the IMF, because they're saying, who is going to refinance all of this debt? And at what rate? This is a huge problem. And she makes a note and a point to say this problem is concentrated rather than systemic. Yes, it is concentrated. It's concentrated because it happened for a singular event that the global world handled differently than any other smallpox that we had in 1917, handled completely differently than any prior pandemic ever by shutting down businesses and keeping people at home and locked down. We had to print so much money. We printed so much money to keep depressions at bay. But now we have to pay the piper. So I am not the only person that is stating that there is massive global financial economic problems that are here now in 2024. The other thing I want to talk about is this December retail sales number that came out that was just a phenomenal, we had a beat for December retail sales. And so people are saying, economists are saying, no, there's no soft landing is here because we have a good December jobs report and we have the consumer retail is still spending. But the truth is the consumer is not still spending. In fact, what we know is that between November 1st and December 31st of 2023, 222 billion, in fact, over 222 billion was bought by consumers in the United States through what we call buy now, pay later. These Klarnas, these Afterpays, these Affirms, when you go to whatever you're on, whatever e-commerce site you're on, even airlines, and you're checking out, you can now pick one of these other alternative payment systems. And it's basically, we will pay this up front to your vendor that you're buying, you're shopping at this store, and you will pay us over the next 3 months or 4 months. Now, what we realize is a lot of people, $222 billion worth of purchases happened to really save kind of the retail season in America. You can see here, this is that article saying buy now, pay later surged the highest level during the 2023 holiday spending spree. So while the retail number looks good, what we now understand is that a lot of people expect their year bonuses to come up and help pay off that debt. What we're seeing here is a survey that says that the bonuses in 2023 are going to take substantial hits. So in other words, the bonuses that are paying it out in 2024 for 2023 are going to be a lot reduced. And the average is a 21% reduction. And not only are bonuses 21% less, but we also have less people getting bonuses. And so here's where the rubber meets the road between the student loan debt resumption of payments in October of last year and this $222 billion that was bought on buy now, pay later, but pay in 3 or 4 installments. So it's like when we say later, we just mean like in the next 6 months. These two things alone are going to really allow us to see what is happening with the U.S. consumer for the balance of 2024. And when the consumer stops spending and the retail numbers show that the consumer is now done spending, then you're going to start to really see a problem developing in the United States economically. And I'm going to take myself off the screen for just a second. I just want to share this with you. And this is reading of the tea leaves. So, when we look back at how coronavirus kind of unfolded and how all of the events happened, I distinctly remember being in Washington, D.C. For a conference and getting home, that this is like March the 5th of 2020, and being notified by the conference organizer that somebody at the conference had tested positive for coronavirus and that I was potentially exposed. And that was my beginning knowledge, literally, personally, of coronavirus. And then, obviously it became a global thing, and we went down the rabbit hole and investigated a lot of information on coronavirus. And we discovered that, in fact, coronavirus, certain things with coronavirus had been addressed by governments of the world prior to 2020. Specifically, they had the simulation in New York through a bunch of NGOs. It's called Event 201. That was in October of 2019, where they actually modeled a coronavirus coming forward globally and creating a pandemic. And of course, that is just a little bit suspect. Like, we can't have a modeling of what actually happens like the very next year within a matter of 3 months, or even that month, or even in the fall. Now that we know, I think case 1 was potentially in the end of 2019. So we have learned through coronavirus kind of the mechanism and the machinations that happen prior to a new global situation. In America, we understand that this is our presidential election year, and that a lot of shenanigans do happen during presidential election years just for whatever reason. So there's that. But what is interesting is that we now see the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos last week. And one thing that they did that was really eerily reminiscent of 2020 is they had a panel, not on coronavirus, but a panel on disease X. And you can see here that this disease X panel is them preparing and talking through the preparedness of global coordination of resources, both medical and non-medical, to prepare and have the world prepared for disease X. So, and understanding kind of how coronavirus promulgated, I went ahead and went back to look at, legislation. And in fact, there was a congressional act passed in 2023 by the US Congress, specifically regarding disease X. So I say all that to say that we're starting to see a lot of eerie similarities from the beginning of 2020 and now 2024, both election years. And so I want to just give you this just personal information and potential warning that says, be alert, because this is a global transition year. With the joining of Saudi Arabia and the UAE to the BRICS bloc of nations, and I need you to understand that the GDP now of the BRICS nations, which was, of course, before, BRICS itself stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But then you add in Saudi Arabia, the country in charge of OPEC, UAE, obviously massive reserves, and of course Iran joined with them. When you look at the block now that BRICS represents, there's more GDP in the BRICS block than there are in the G7 nations of the West. And of course, when we say the West, we also include Japan, Australia, New Zealand in the West, which is Europe, the UK, Canada, the United States, and the other countries that I mentioned. When we talk about the size of the blocks of BRICS, it now economically exceeds the size of the G7 of the West. And so really at any moment we could have some kind of pronouncement by the OPEC that the crude sales will no longer occur exclusively in the US dollar, opening up to potentially the euro. More likely, they're not going to use a Western currency at all. So we would expect potentially the Chinese yuan. But a lot of people make a lot of hub about the fact that the yuan or the renminbi could never replace the US dollar because its circulation size is just way too minuscule and insignificant to actually supplant the US dollar. And while that is true, you have to understand that the other competing project plan is to move us to digital currency or CBDCs at the same time. So you don't need to worry about the size of your currency circulating if the goal is to move to CBDC digital. Everything is digital. There is no more currency. No one cares about the size of the circulation because, again, it becomes a digital payment processing system and it no longer is actual tangible. And we do know that certainly getting rid of cash was one of the goals that they had in 2020. It just was not effectively realized. So I think a lot of lessons were learned for 2020, and we will see if this disease X does come forward in 2024, which all indicators on all of the news bubbling under the surface in these level channels are very it is a breeding topic. If this does come forward, I would expect that you would see cash transactions attacked much more harshly than we ever thought possible in 2020. And because we do expect that there is a global currency transition coming very soon, it would make a lot of sense that all of these transitions are happening because they're trying to push us and move us to a central bank digital currency, not to be confused with cryptocurrency, which is a distributed ledger on the blockchain that is not controllable by anybody. That's the whole point. So, central bank digital currencies are the fastest way to totalitarianism that exists on planet Earth, other than a military superpower that has just no potential enemies. They just have absolute capabilities. You could get people in cages faster with that kind of military. But if you're trying to change the world in as much of a diplomatic way as possible from a lay person who's ingrained in their social media and they don't have any clue what's really happening in the world, the easiest way is to say cash is dirty. We don't want you interacting with cash anymore. We don't want to have all these banks that keep cash so that you can use cash, when everything really can be as simple as digital and on your phone. And so that's what we're expecting for 2024, amongst a sea of economic disruption because of all of the debt that is coming due. And then you also have to think banks lend, the problem with banks that people don't understand, the reason I spent so much painstaking time on showing you how much aggressively they're tightening their lending standards, is because banks make interest on the difference between what they loan out and what they borrow. They're borrowing on the short term and loaning out on the longer term, and they usually make a nice net interest spread on that. That's how banks make money. The problem is right now, we've had our yield curve inverted since 2022, longest inversion sharpest inversion we've had in forever. So if the banks are lending on the long term, which is paying smaller rates than borrowing on the short term, in other words, our yield curve is paying less to borrow on the long term than it is to borrow on the short term. That tells you, that's one economic indicator they cannot manipulate. It is a true indicator, and it tells you that reckoning, a global economic reckoning is coming, because it tells you that the short term is more risky than the long term, because eventually this will get resolved. But this is telling us, the rates of the world are telling us that the short term is riskier and more potentially viably disruptive than even the long term, because by the time the long term comes, we will have figured it all out. And that is an economic indicator that they cannot obfuscate and they cannot hide, and it tells us the truth. And that's exactly also why banks have got to be so tight. Remember what happened in March of 2023? We had a banking collapse starting, and then the Federal Reserve put out the Bank Term Funding Program, and everything was all better, but it wasn't. It just was a Band-Aid. And now we're here. So listen to all of the Wall Street news all day long you want to, but I'm telling you that the economic fundamentals that cannot be denied, they can be hidden, but they will not be denied. This is what 2024 is. It is a year of reckoning, and these are the reasons why. So until next time, you guys, that doesn't mean that we're without hope. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do. And I certainly practice that message in my client base on a personalized basis with individual clients. It's not information and guidance I want to give out globally, because everyone's situation is different. But I don't want you to walk away and say, well, gosh, just, throw my hands up and forget all about it all now. No, I'm not saying that. I'm going to be doing this podcast with you every single week as we go through this year. And I'm going to be talking to you about the things that you can do to preventively and proactively get through this pain that is coming. It is due. We cannot just print money indefinitely forever. We are at the end of global fiat currency that has absolutely nothing backing it but the full faith and credit of the sovereign governments that are printing that currency. And it should be the end of it, because why? Because look what we've done in America. Look what we've done. We've said it doesn't matter how much we print. You shouldn't care as long as we can service our debt. And that's just ridiculous. Nobody believes that that is true. And this is going to be the pain that proves it. So until next time, everybody, have a great week. Take care. Hey.